Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Ojer Axonil, a mono-red burn or group slug, but I'm going to really say burn combo deck. This is one of our donation decks of the week coming from Asclepius, who says what they need help is survivability. I understand the moment that I have my board state built and Ojer hits the field, I'm already public enemy number one. I've been trying to find ways to protect my commander against removal and or polymorphs, but being mono-red limits my choices. I've played a version of this deck in dual commander format with some success, but I feel that if I can't eliminate someone in 1 to 3 turns after Ojer can normally hit the field at turn 4, then I will stall out and be a sitting duck. In a normal commander pod setup, I understand that this may be way more difficult, so it might be better just to tune this deck for the dual commander format. In terms of restrictions, they say, if anything, keeping it dual commander legal. Absolutely, we can definitely work on that. I think there's a lot to be said about, I think more than just kind of a deck building angle of how to work Ojer and how to work around removal, but a gameplay angle as well. But I'm going to leave that into after we start looking at the deck, and so let's take a look at the commander and let's see what we can find. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Ojer Axonil Deepest Might, and why are they our mono-red combo burn group slug commander? Well, they're a 4/4 legendary god. They have trample. They have awesome half mix of dinosaur and not dinosaur. I think that's really, really cool. And they have 2 abilities, though that first one is the one people care about the most. And it says, if a red source you control would deal an amount of non-combat damage that's less than this creature's power to an opponent, that source deals damage equal to this creature's power instead. Long story short, that means generally, any amount of non-combat damage you would deal is going to be at least 4 at a time. So this heavily benefits small bits of damage, think impact tremor effect, goblin bombardment effects, any form of like ping effects. As long as it hits an opponent, not a creature, will do 4 at a time, which when you really think about it is like a quadruple, multiplier on a lot of effects, which is really, really impressive. Now, that second ability, which we're going to touch back on in a second, says that when Ojer Axonil dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. So what is the other side? Well, it's the Temple of Power. Temple of Power is not legendary, funny enough. Is a land that taps for red mana, enters tapped, if you will, because that's the only way you'll get to this side. And for 2 red, you can tap this and transform it. You can only do this if you've done 4 or more red damage to anything, non-combat damage, and you can only activate it as a sorcery. So you're still paying the full 4 when you think about it if you're tapping this card and 4 other lands, but it does allow you to be constantly casting Ojer at like or Ojer Axonil at the 4 mana that they come with originally, which is really good. And a deck like this has a pretty easy time activating that meeting that challenge of dealing 4 damage, because when you think of something like End the Festivities, hits 3, 1 for each opponent, and then if it hits 1 creature, that's 4 non-combat damage, right? It's not at opponents necessarily, so a lot of these kind of effects will be very, very effective. Looking at the deck itself, honestly, I'm very happy with it. There's very few things that kind of catch my eye as things I don't want, and almost all of them are just kind of win more or kind of clunky. Everything else in the deck, I think, does the job really, really well. We're running 33, 34 with the MDFC. That is our commander, so I'm going to consider it generally 33. Actually, I think you should just consider it 33, which is a bit low, which I might suggest to add 1 or 2, or I'm going to suggest some MDFCs. But with our curve so low, it's pretty reasonable. Obviously 9 is Blasphemous Act, which it often is, but the rest of the curve is incredibly low, not even including cards like Gut Shot and I'm sure a few others that are reduced in mana cost. or cards like Simian Spirit Guide that don't have a mana cost, you just exile it from hand. Alright, so looking at this, before we go into some cuts, let's go back to Ojer for a second. Let's talk about the mentality of this deck and how it can use Ojer and the situation where you play Ojer and Ojer dies. Now, not to be blunt, I look at this list and you say, well, Ojer comes into play and my opponents kill him. Yeah, they would. They absolutely would, because otherwise they almost instantaneously lose the game. Consider what I would say is a reasonable situation where you have, let's say, one electrostatic field type card, you have like End the Festivities or even like a Flame Jab, and then like, I don't know, let's say another one, because you have so many of these kind of like tap down to deal 1 damage abilities. Using these cards in unison is upwards like of 12 damage just by themselves to each opponent. And then if you use this Thermo Alchemist for another tap, that's 16. But let's go with the 12, which adds up to 36 damage for casting like 1 spell, right? If you reasonably have a few of these spells, let's say Gut Shots, let's say you have a few more of these cards that will deal 1 damage when you cast a non-creature spell or an instant or sorcery. If you have more of these tap to deal damage, which you could run more, think of like the sheer damage you could effortlessly dole out is just mind-blowing. And that's just on the turn that Axonil comes out. Leading up to this, you're still using these abilities, and a lot of them are just kind of value plays where occasionally, you're going to be casting things like Lightning Bolt fairly to destroy a creature, that needs to be destroyed, and meanwhile Gutter Snipe is just going to deal a bunch of damage, like 6 damage for free, right? That's not even including things that maybe trigger on not just instant sorceries such as Firebrand Archer on non-creature spell, and you're setting up a Blood Moon. Like the amount of incidental damage you're going to be doing generally is very, very good. And then the turn you drop Ojer, whoa, the game is basically should be over on the spot, right? So to me, your opponent's reactions are sound. They're very, very sound. And even more so, I would say, this is kind of the proof of a phenomenon that I feel like people forget. This is the phenomenon that if you build your deck around your commander, your opponents will eventually learn to keep your commander off the battlefield. So, is this a problem? If your opponents are playing correctly against your deck and you're finding your deck is struggling, is this necessarily a problem? And I think no. I think this is very much so fair and just. Okay, very much so intended, let's say. Fair and just may be the wrong words. I think what's happening here is that maybe you're undervaluing the sheer power level of the deck and what it's capable of. And maybe if you play with that in mind, you will have a better time. The first thing about playing with that in mind is that perhaps Ojer should not be cast on turn 4. Ojer Axonil should be kept until you have, let's say, 7 mana, hypothetically, which is a bit difficult to reach at in a deck like this. But let's say you can get to like 7 mana, or let's say 6 mana and like a Grape Shot. Sorry, not Grape Shot. Where is our Gut Shot? Very close, but Gut Shot, where you can represent slamming down your commander and immediately casting several spells in a row that will make it so your opponents will immediately be hated out of the game. Obviously, things like Impact Tremors with it out and Ojer Axonil doing 4 damage to each opponent on ETB, or cards like Rolling Vortex, or surprisingly missing Sulfurous Vortex that does 2 damage. It's another vortex, so it does damage on upkeep. Likewise would deal 4 damage on each upkeep. Like, you can set it up that the moment Ojer comes out, you have the mana and ability to do things. And that would be, beyond everything else, my straightforward advice. You need to be playing Ojer a little differently. On the other hand, something that catches my eye is that Ojer comes with, intrinsic built-in recursion, right? Now, you've said specifically like your opponents are going to shuffle them or put back into your deck or put on your top or bottom of your deck, and yes, that fights Ojer's natural protection, and I will have some answers to that. But even then, just cast Ojer for 6. It feels like maybe the problem is that you are setting yourself up for one big turn, and you're perhaps trying to go at that turn too early. Would that make sense? You know, you're trying to slam Ojer with no extra mana or 1 extra mana holding up, you know, like Bolt instead of something like Lava Dart, which is really powerful. And so you are setting yourself up to wait a turn cycle. And though Ojer is immune to some removal, not all removal, and therefore will be burned off the table or Swords to Plowshares or board wipe or whatever it needs to be. So, with that in mind, let's look at some cards that I think we can cut before we go into some additions that I think will solve the problems, or will at least help in conjuncture with a change in how we're going to play Ojer. Those are the two parts. I'm going to give additions to protect, but also Ojer needs to be played a bit slower. But let's look at what we can take out. So the first thing that catches my eye is basically everything at the top of our curve. When we are playing at 33 lands, and Ojer is our commander, and I've already said Ojer is probably better at a higher mana, like when you have more mana up, we still want to see what's at the top of our curve and what is particularly good and what is maybe costing too much. So right off the bat, Koth of the Hammer is a particularly bad card. Don't get me wrong, I understand how that -2 can be really good and solve that problem that I just brought up of like, hey, so you play Koth, you uptick, whatever, you go back to your turn, you downtick, you generate a bunch of mana, and then you have your Ojer turn. You cast Ojer, and ideally you have another 4 to 5 mana, maybe more, to spend into Ojer and win right away. I get that. I don't see why something like Thran Dynamo or any other form of Mana Rock won't do that same job, but better. Because there is still a chance that you slam Koth and your opponents, hungry for blood, attack him out of the game, right? And the fact that otherwise, you know, he doesn't really do much. Yes, his emblem is insanely powerful here, but no, you're never getting to that emblem. Your deck itself also implies a certain power level that Koth just cannot, you know, live up to. So Koth is an easy cut. Though not in 4 mana, this is a good moment to touch on Chandra Dressed to Kill. Don't get me wrong, Chandra is a really interesting planeswalker in mono red, where almost universally this top ability will work. And even then, I don't think she's good enough. I think it's very cute. I think you can just do better. This is definitely, once again, another card, like, think about what this turn replaces. You play Chandra, you plus 1 probably on that first ability, and then what? Outside of like Soul Ring, Commander's Plate, these 2 creatures, and Dragon Mantle, even Dragon Mantle, not so much, you don't have a permanent thing you can put on the battlefield for 1 mana. So most likely you're spending that mana and what? You're flame jabbing, you're doing something else. Probably nothing meaningful outside of killing a creature. So the first turn she comes down, she's really not doing much. What have you given up to play Chandra? And this is not just for turn 3, which is what I'm focusing on. I'm talking about almost any turn. And the truth is, you've given up playing one of these electrostatic field type cards. You've given up playing Gutter Snipe. You've given up playing Cinder Pyro. You've given up playing the Catapult or any form of the Catapult cards, right? That's a huge difference, I think. And I think a very, very meaningful difference, because those cards win you the game, whereas Chandra puts you ahead, kind of. She generates mana that you have to use, or cards you have to use and roll into a red card, and for the cards to be relevant, and I don't think that's really where you want to be. So I would cut both Planeswalkers. Looking at the Defilers I think are interesting, My main problem is when it comes to red permanents, we are kind of limited. We have 21 creatures and we have a bunch of enchantments, so about a third of the deck. I guess that's fine. My problem with this is that Defiler of Instinct fights against what the rest of the deck does, where the rest of the deck benefits of you casting instants and sorceries, whereas Defiler of Instinct wants you to cast permanents. Is this a problem? I don't think necessarily so. I think there's something worth considering about how this allows you to diversify damage, but in a board where you have multiple cards that trigger off of instants and sorceries, and Defiler of Instinct, do you cast the instant or sorcery, or do you cast the permanent spell? I think generally you'll do the first one, making Defiler kind of clunky to work with. If this was all red spells that cost one less red pip, well, it'd be broken, but I think it would also be much, much better. Sulfim, I think, is fine. I think several of these red cards, Sulfim, Torbrand, and to an extent Urabrask, all have a certain kind of doubling effect to them that works really, really well with our commander. Of course, Torbrand works a little, like, I think you just get to, because these are both replacement effects, right? So you get to choose which one to do. And if Ojer hits, so if you use Torbrand's ability and it's less than 4, Ojer will then trigger going to 4. Is that how it works? I think you could trigger it the other way too, right? You can, let's say, deal 1 damage, bring it up to 4 with Ojer Axonil, and then add 2. That should be fine, I think, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Regardless, this is a very good impression of Ojer because it allows all these spells to do 3 damage instead of 4, which is pretty close. Big fan. So all of these I like. I think these are fine. Storm Splitter, I think, is cute. This is likewise very close to what Ojer does in terms of you want to cast Storm Splitter and then you want to cast a bunch of spells. But Storm Splitter doesn't do anything remotely similar to the power level of Ojer, right? Ojer is doing 12 to 16 damage after a flurry of spells or triggers, whereas Storm Splitter does 1 additional damage per spell, and that's if it gets through, right? This is not very good. The cutest thing about this is that if you're being attacked, you can cast spells to put up blockers. I don't know. This is not the kind of deck this wants to be in. The fact that there's no synergy between this and Ojer because it doesn't deal non-combat damage also makes it a bit tough. This is better in, like, if Torbrand was your commander, but Torbrand is not your commander, so Storm Splitter, though really cute and cool, this is not where they belong. Looking at our non-creature spells, we have Fiery Confluence. This is a weird one because this will just do 6 damage, right? Most of the time. Not always. You'll probably do either 1/1/2 or 1/2/2, right? You'll either do 1 damage to each creature and 4 damage to each opponent, or 2 damage to each creature and 2 damage to each opponent. The thing is because they're not separate triggers, because they are not separate damage packets, let's say, you can't use Ojer to like it's not like Storm where you do 1 to everyone, that's 4 each, 1 to everyone, 4 each, 1 to everyone, 4 each. Fiery Confluence is just going to be 2 to each opponent, goes up to 4. And that's really not that interesting. It's sorcery speed, so it's not even instant speed. It's very clunky. It's basically a bad board clear where you could be playing instead Anger of the Gods or any of the ones that just deal straight 3 or 4 damage to all creatures, and you'd be generally happier. But that being even said, obviously one of the better board clears you have access to is End the Festivities with Ojer out, which does 4 damage to everything you don't control, and that's fantastic. Obviously, Blasphemous Act is better, but like End the Festivities does a very good impression. So I think this is a cut. Flame Fusillade is interesting. I like that it says permanence, but it costs 4 mana, so it's 4 less of your permanence. The neat thing about this is it allows you to tap down your these electrostatic field creatures to do something. I think that's just fine, right? I just don't think that's good enough. We already have catapult effects if we wanted to like take advantage of a card that we can be like, oh, if you keep untapping the card, you'll keep doing damage. Yeah, that's how these cards work anyway. So why are we doing this? Like, why are we adding another step to it? Whereas we already have cards that do this better. The fact that you can use this to hit permanents, I think is very, very cute. But Ojer doesn't trigger off of permanents. It only triggers, target creatures. The fact that this hits creatures, I should say, is really cute, but Ojer doesn't trigger off that, only when you hit your opponent. So therefore, this does very, very little, and I don't think it's what you want to do. If you went extremely wide with tokens, maybe I'd be wrong, but this is a very, very poor comparison to Koth's ultimate, which already doesn't really impress me. Past in Flames also just does not belong here. I think you need way more of a storm deck, and this is only somewhat of a storm deck. Don't get me wrong, we definitely have some of our red ramp, which is really, really nice, and you can definitely do some things with it, with Seething Song. I just don't think we have enough setup. Without the access to another color or enough looting to make sure we have the right cards in our hand and the right cards in our graveyard, Past in Flames becomes just a very, very clunky, maybe we'll get some spells back spell. You're playing it very fairly. And in this kind of situation, I think it's going to be more of a liability where either it's in your hand and not doing anything, or in your graveyard and your opponents are doubly so threatened by you and therefore attack you twice as much, right? I think it's an easy cut as well. Bolt Bend, very much so impressed, love that card. Aether Sting is cute. I wish it was 3 mana, but still cute. Mana Barbs is fantastic. So generally, if we cut down those 4 drops, I'm looking really quickly if there's anything else. I don't particularly like Chandra because you do not have a choice to flip her, and on her flip side, she's just one more trigger, whereas I think you would actually prefer her as a catapult almost to keep untapping rather than flipping her, and then all of a sudden you can, if it's not your turn, you can't even use her because part of the perk of these catapults, you can use them on opponents' turns or with or on the stack, right? Something like, let's compare it once again to the Unruly Catapult, where the catapult, you tap it with Ojer on the battlefield, one of your opponents responds by trying to remove Ojer, and then you cast another spell, untapping Unruly Catapult to get another trigger in for 4 damage for each opponent, right? That's where the power is, and Chandra just does not allow you to do that because, actually, if the first one doesn't trigger, it does, but if you are trying to get multiple triggers out of her, I guess you don't let them resolve. Okay, I guess maybe it's fine. You just don't let them resolve. And I don't know to what, like, it won't work with sorcery spells, but you can burn through all of your instant spells in a row, keep untapping Chandra, right? And then every time you do that, you let her ability go onto the stack, and then you react to it and keep going. So that once you go through the stack, all of those pings will come through. That being said, once again, this is one target player, and if they get rid of Ojer, it's only one. Like, if you stack them all and don't let them resolve, they are more benefited by getting rid of Ojer when you have like 3 of these triggers on the stack. So even when I try to make it work, it's not very good. So I think Chandra is an easy cut. The rest of the deck I generally like. Let's go into additions before we get too late here. All right, let's start with, I think the easiest addition here is Gamble. This deck is very strong. It has a lot of haymakers that really catch my eye, and I would just like ways to draw into them. And Gamble is a very fun, very accessible tutor in mono red. So generally, it would depend on your play group. You didn't say anything about it, so I think it's still fine. Dual Commander, I didn't really talk about this because most of my viewers aren't playing it, but I'm pretty sure nothing I'm suggesting is on the ban list. And also, I think Dual Commander, you are going to do really well there. And so I don't think the deck needs to be changed for Dual Commander. When you don't have 3 opponents removing Ojer, I think it's going to be fine. I think you'll be able to power through a lot. But Gamble, as long as your play group is very much so okay with tutors, especially Gamble, which is like the fairest tutor in my mind, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this. Moving on, I've got the two-sided MDFCs from Modern Horizons 3. Obviously, Pinnacle Monk is really nice because it can buy you back one of your instants or sorceries. It has prowess. It's fine. Sundering Eruption, I think, is neat too. You can use it to destroy like very specific targets of lands that you need off the battlefield. The creatures without flying can't block this turn. Can be useful to get like 5 or 6 extra damage when you can get an attack in with a bunch of creatures. Maybe even more if Ojer is out. I think that's fine. But for both of these cards, I think you're generally much, much happier just having access to an extra land that you can play. And 3 damage to yourself is really not meaningful to you because you're not too worried and you can power through. Alright, let's talk about protecting our commander. The easiest one right here is Lightning Greaves. I feel like Lightning Greaves is notably missing here. I think maybe because you thought the haste is not very valuable, but I think the Shroud very much so is. Actually, on Shroud, let's go back a second, because there were a few cards that I wanted to very briefly touch on. Namely the auras, because this would be, I think, the argument against something like Shroud, right? Is that we can't put Dragon's Mantle onto our commander. We can't put, Claws of Valakut or Granite Grip onto your commander. We can't put Arcane Teachings. I'm going to say it's okay. I'm going to say you don't really, you're not going to mind. I think having a commander with Shroud is going to be way more valuable than having those auras attached. And generally, I think those auras are already a little win more. I didn't want to touch them because I've already said a lot to cut. But if you cut those auras, I think you'd be fine. I think Ojer already brings enough to the table without feeling the need to add even more to that number. Dealing 4 per spell versus dealing 7 per spell is less of a difference than you'd actually think. And notably, not only is our problem was keeping Ojer on the board. Now we're attaching auras to them, which means we need them on the board. We need additional mana for the auras, and then we need additional. You can't see my hands. I'm stacking hands here. We need Ojer. We need the mana for the enchantment, and then we need to cast spells. That needs a tremendous amount of mana. While we're losing, when we lose Ojer, we're losing even more. This is a bad idea, very, very, very much so, and I think you'll be much happier to just play Ojer and spend the same mana you'd play on Fists of Valakut, or Claws of Valakut, sorry, instead on 2 spells, 3 spells maybe, to deal the damage right away. Likewise, Dragon Mantle not only needs to be attached, it gives fire breathing, so you can't even just get the power increase, you have to spend mana into them. Okay, sorry, going back, bit on a tangent, but I really don't like those cards here. So, Lightning Greaves gives us Shroud, Champion's Helm gives us Hexproof, which is also very, very strong, but I wanted to go in a different direction, because honestly, the problem with some of those two is that we need priority and we need to be able to get that equip off, right? When we have Lightning Greaves and we have our commander and our opponents have removal already, we actually don't have a chance to do anything with it. So I wanted to suggest a few cards, at least 2 I think, that work with Ojer's natural and that whole cycle's natural protection. So here we have Claws of Gix. What does Claws of Gix do? Well, for 1 mana, you sacrifice a permanent and you gain 1 life. What's the idea here? Well, Ojer's ability triggers on death. So what we're going to do is find ways to kill them, right? This will get us around any form of exile. This will get us around any form of shuffle, return to hand, which I guess is not the worst, but like put on top of the deck, that kind of effect. Anything that will stop that trigger from happening, Claws of Gix will be there, and so will the next card, to basically say, well, nope, I get it as a land no matter what, and therefore I will work next turn or the turn after to get them out from under the land. So Claws of Gix really catches my eye. Flare of Duplication really catches my eye. This is the one I absolutely want you to play, because not only is this just a good card in your deck, because it does a lot for how your deck works, it also works very, very uniquely with Ojer, because it allows you to sacrifice Ojer to block a Swords to Plowshares or a bounce effect or whatever. But then it allows you to retarget that or to use that Swords to Plowshares yourself, right, with a copy, and then exile someone else's commander or exile something else or whatever you like to get, more of your game plan going while pseudo protecting your commander by putting them under the land, right? And this will also trigger any Magecraft you have. I'm not sure if you have any, I didn't see it, but if you were to have Magecraft, this would trigger it, in addition to Flare of Duplication triggering itself. So Flare is something that really catches my eye. Then the last few things I wanted to kind of suggest was that I felt you could go a bit further into the group slug or the punishment aspect of the game, where not only are you going to kind of play a little smarter with your commander, you're going to protect them as much as you can, you're going to kill them off, like you're going to do all of these steps, but I also want you to kind of start frustrating your opponent's attempts to stop you. Now you're already playing both Blood Moon effects, which I really, really like, and we're going to play another Moon effect in a second, but on the way there, something like Eidolon of the Great Revel is really, really good, because most likely their removal is 3 mana or less. So they'll cast Swords to Plowshares, they'll target Ojer, and let's say you're already prepared for it, you have some spells to cast, whatever, you've got a sacrifice to cast. In their process of doing this, Eidolon is going to trigger, target 4 damage at them, right? And that's going to go off before the swords even finishes, removing your commander. So that's going to be really, really nice and make people think twice. At a certain point, this is counter magic because as your opponent's life total gets lower and lower, they are unable to cast certain spells. That's not even including just playing Eidolon on like turn 2 and just reaping the rewards of your opponent slowly burning themselves out. Very, very good card. Used to be an extremely expensive card, is no longer the case. Take advantage of that. Likewise, Mage, Bane, Lizard. Both of these cards are double-edged swords. They'll hit you too, but to an extent, you don't care. Even though Mage, Bane, Lizard is just very, very scary against you to an extent, because you're going to cast multiple instants and sorceries or non-creatures in a row. Because they're not being multiplied, I don't think you care. I think you just take the L and take the damage. Sure, you'll go 1 damage to yourself, 2 damage to yourself, 3 damage to yourself, 4 damage to yourself, let's say if you have four spells. If those 4 spells are being cast and Ojer's out, you are doing at least 16 damage to each of your opponents, right? Not even including all of the other things that are triggering off your spells and burning them out of the game. So Mage, Bane, Lizard holding you back, same thing with Eidolon. I don't think it's a real problem. I think you're going to benefit. Not even including how this damage will be multiplied by Ojer on the as your opponents cast spells. War's Toll is on the same page, another card that less so in damage, but I want you to interact with your opponents to frustrate their abilities to deal with you. War's Toll is a really, really good example of this. Now, do know that this is also 4 mana, though I've asked you to take a bunch out. I find this to be a much better 4 mana card than some of the cards I've advised to be cut. This basically forces your opponents to be all in on every one of their decisions. Every attack is a full attack, and every tap is a full tap of their mana. Do note, players who are thinking things through will play creatures after, and therefore, or have summoning sick creatures that they get to hold up. Likewise, they'll play their lands after they've tapped all their mana so they can still hold up mana on your turn. That being said, it still makes it really, really difficult to do so. And I believe the last edition, the other moon is Winter Moon. I think you can play Winter Moon pretty cheaply. I believe we are at 24 mountains, which means though, there is a cost to playing this card, even though some of our lands, we just don't care to untap them, our opponents are going to be much more affected by Winter Moon, and you're going to be really, really happy with the results. That's not even including like the potential turn 3 play where you gamble into the Winter Moon and play Winter Moon, putting your opponents in a very difficult situation where you set up for the next turn to set up even further and the turn after to play Ojer, right? I would see that to be very, very powerful. And those are my additions. Thank you so much for sending the deck and supporting the channel. I really think this is a fun, strong deck. I've been building Torbran on the side for just like a mono red group slug, and it makes me want to play Ojer for sure. And it makes me wonder if Ojer is always this price, or if it's just the art. Oh well, I'll figure that out later. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for sending in the deck. Good luck, and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.